Welcome to the Service webinar for this month. It's wonderful to see so many familiar names in the chat, so thank you for joining. We're excited to work through a new topic with you today, but before we begin, I want to highlight the Questions tab, which you can use to ask questions throughout the meeting. You should see that option at the side or bottom of the page. As always, we have several team members who can answer questions directly through that tab, kind of throughout the call. And if you have a question that's relevant for the entire group, they'll pass them along for a Q&A session at the end. If you do have questions that you don't get answered before you have to leave, our customer support team will also reach out to you afterwards. I also always like to point out the resources that you have available to you. So a couple things. Obviously, when you're logged into your account, you'll always see at the bottom of the page this Need Help option, which is how you engage with our customer support team. From this menu, you can search for a question, different topics through here. There's a lot of articles in here that have to do with different parts of the system. Obviously, this is a great resource if you like to have laid out lists of instructions, things like that. We do keep all this up to date, put a lot of work into this. But you can also use this to contact our support team. And then I also wanted to mention that you can access our recorded webinars and trainings if you go to video.servicetech.com. That'll take you to our YouTube channel. On here, we have a lot of recorded webinars from the past. We also have different playlists on specific subjects. And then we also have a lot of short form tutorials here as well, which you can kind of use to brush up on specific subjects. Most of this resource is intended for administrators. However, there are some options here for volunteers. Generally, this would be something you might send out if you want your volunteers to learn about a specific subject. We're going to pass along in the chat the link to subscribe to our YouTube channel. So if you want to follow us along there, please feel free to do so. And with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into our subject for today. So today we're going to be looking at the sign-in console, all the options kind of associated with the sign-in console. So first, we'll start off by defining terms. We'll talk about what the sign-in console is and why to use that. After that, we'll walk through how a volunteer engages with the sign-in console, what dialogues appear that the volunteer can use, and how they interact with the sign-in console. Next, we'll talk about different ways that you can adjust hours using the sign-in console or record impact tracking metrics. And then we'll look at kind of variations of the sign-in console. We'll talk about mobile sign-in and QR code options. And then lastly, we'll take a look at where all the settings are associated with the sign-in console and how you can engage with those. So the first thing to point out is where the sign-in console is and what it is. So the sign-in console is essentially a standalone kiosk that you can open up on any sort of internet-connected device. So tablet, laptop, desktop, smartphone. As long as you have internet access on that device, you can use that device as a sign-in console. I typically like to use something larger than a smartphone, like a tablet size or larger, but that's up to you. You really just need to have internet access. You don't need to have any sort of special device. And what the sign-in console will provide or afford is the ability for you to have volunteers track their attendance electronically. So you can indicate or have volunteers sign in when they arrive. You can also have volunteers sign out when they leave, and that would record exactly how long they were there for that particular engagement. The sign-in console can be opened in a couple different ways, but before we kind of dive into all the specifics of it, I just want to mention one thing. You do not necessarily have to use the sign-in console for hours to be recorded into Service. Service assumes that volunteers attended their shift for the full duration. If they're registered for an event, they will get full credit for that event unless something happens to disrupt that. So whether you mark someone as a no-show or they cancel a registration or they unregister themselves or you unregister them from the event, or if you're using the sign-in console and you have somebody sign in and out, then those hours are going to be adjusted in those cases. And of course, you can also manually adjust hours. But like I said, you do not necessarily have to use the sign-in console for hours to be recorded. What it can be used for is to amend that information if you want more specifics about when people arrived, how long they stayed, or you just want to be more specific about those hours reporting. Okay, but to open the sign-in console, there's kind of two main methods. The first is to log in as an administrator or someone with leadership team, group leader, or event leader. Anyone with higher than volunteer access can open the sign-in console. Just log in from the admin side of Service. Under the Opportunity Management heading, click Sign-in Console or Kiosk, and then you'll be presented with some options to open the sign-in console. Before we dig into that, I want to mention that you can get a direct link to the sign-in console from our customer support team. So I mentioned the Need Help button earlier. You can search for different topics through here, but if you click on Contact Us, you can submit a question asking for a direct link to your sign-in console, even with specific settings of opening that sign-in console. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But that direct link could be something that you might bookmark, especially if you have a device that you are consistently using or is only used as a sign-in kiosk, maybe like a tablet in a lobby that you have kind of locked up, things like that. You can then bookmark the sign-in console, and then volunteers can open it themselves. You wouldn't have to log in to open that sign-in kiosk. It kind of operates a little bit more hands-off. Otherwise, you can always, again, open the sign-in console on any device from the admin side. Click on Sign-in Console or Kiosk, and that will pop up this dialog. There's a few different settings associated with the sign-in console. So you can filter it by an interest category or by a tag. What this allows you to do is to say, hey, for this event, I don't want all of my events to show up. I only want a specific set. So maybe if you have a kiosk set up at a particular location, you might filter by that location if you have a keyword or if you have a tag for that, or if you have an interest category for it. This can just limit volunteers accidentally interacting with the wrong opportunities. You don't have to apply a filter. You can leave that to show all. Below that, there's an option to allow volunteers to create a profile via walk-in registration. This is a setting in your system. If you don't see this dialog option, that's because you don't have it turned on. We'll talk about where to turn that on in a moment. And then one other setting that can pop up here, and you might see it in your system, would be the ability to print out name tags when volunteers sign in. So if you have a Dymo label writer in your possession and you want to use that to print out name tags, you'll see some settings related to that in here. And again, I'll show you where that's enabled in the system configuration later. But at the bottom of this, the kind of two most important options are these buttons down here. When you're opening the sign-in console, you can either choose to open it in sign-in mode or in administration mode. In administration mode, you will remain logged into your account. So if you want to check on who is signed in, you want to just quickly sign someone in or sign someone out, or cancel sign-ins, or just kind of get a tally on how many people are currently signed in, then administration mode is good for that. You should not leave this open for volunteers to engage with. If you want your volunteers to engage with this, you should open it in sign-in mode. And that goes back to what I said kind of at the start of this, that you are still logged into your account. So you can go back to the main dashboard and you still have access to the whole database. You really don't want to leave that open for volunteers to use. So if you're setting up a kiosk for volunteers to engage with, click on Sign-in Console or Kiosk, and then from there, you want to choose Sign-in mode. And when you choose Sign-in mode, it's going to log you out of your account, but it'll open up the Sign-in Console, and it will stay on this page until you choose to close it. There's no timer associated with this, and you can't really break out of this unless you choose to search for the term exit or close, and then that will take you back to the admin login page. So that's intentionally hidden so that volunteers aren't closing the sign-in console on your behalf and you're having to reopen it all the time. But this will just basically stay here as long as the device itself is on. So when a volunteer gets to this, the first step you can see is step 1, enter your volunteer name. So they basically search for their name through here. And if a volunteer has an account and they're registered for something today, they will see their name in here. If a volunteer doesn't have an account or they're not registered for something, by default, their name won't show up in here. Now in my system, I have walk-in registration enabled, which means that a volunteer will see their name in here if they have an account, regardless if they're registered for something, because they could do a walk-in registration. You'll also notice I have an option here to add a profile. Again, this is because I have walk-in registration enabled in my system configuration. So a volunteer could create a profile on site and then register for an opportunity as a walk-in. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but just to kind of assuage that answer, a volunteer must still meet the requirements for a particular event in order to perform a walk-in. They can't just show up and sign in if there's space available. They have to meet the requirements. Okay, but if a volunteer does see their name, they can click on that. From here, a few things can pop up. Now I'm in my demonstration console, so I kind of have all the bells and whistles turned on. You can see here at the top, you could have a questionnaire associated with this process. These questions could just be information gathering, like what you're seeing here. I'm asking a volunteer if they brought a donation, and if so, to describe that. And then below that, I have my terms and conditions popping up. These terms and conditions are appearing because I do not have a current copy on file. If your volunteer has already signed the terms and conditions, this won't show up in here. This is basically like the last step to make sure, hey, if you're actually attending this shift, you have to have signed the terms. Generally, of course, a volunteer might have signed those before they even show up for their shift by registering ahead of time. They'll only show up in here if a volunteer does not have a copy of your current terms already on file. And then at the bottom, there is also a phone number verification. So this phone number verification is just serving to make sure that the volunteer clicked on the right name. So again, all three of these things that we have showing up in here are optional. I kind of alluded to this, but this questionnaire, you can ask whatever you'd like to. It can be information gathering like what I'm doing, or you can have this be prohibitive or restrictive. Maybe you want to ask volunteers, hey, are you sick? And if they say yes, they can't sign in for their shift. So you could do that kind of thing through the sign-in console if you want to, or again, you could just collect information. These questions are presented once per day if a volunteer is interacting with the sign-in console. So again, with those things filled out, a volunteer clicks on submit, and then they'll be brought to a page where they can sign in for their shift. If a volunteer's already registered for something, that's what they'll see. So I'm already registered for this event occurring today. I can click to sign in for that. I'm also registered for the service project, which allows hours to be recorded on site. So I could sign in for that as well. And then like I mentioned, in my system, I also allow walk-in registrations. So there's an option for the volunteer to choose that. If they don't want to sign in for those two things, they want to see what else is happening. Because I have walk-in registration turned on in my system, if a volunteer is not registered for something already, then they'll see the walk-in opportunities automatically. Okay, but if a volunteer clicks to sign in, a message will appear saying they've been successfully signed in. This message will disappear in 10 seconds. The next person could already be signing in or signing out, depending on what their interaction is. So on that note, signing out is basically the exact same process as signing in. A volunteer would just look up their name. And then from there, you can see in this case, because I already signed those terms and I already answered those questions today, I don't have to redo that information. I just have to verify with my phone number. But then if a volunteer wants to sign out from their shift, they can either choose to sign out from here or they can cancel their sign-in. And if a volunteer signs out, the system is going to record exactly how long that person was there, from the time that they signed in to the time that they sign out, down to the minute. So the system records this in increments of 1 minute, but it does record it in hours, essentially. There's one other thing I want to point out on this page before we go ahead and sign out, and that's that a volunteer can view their activity history. This is a setting, and I'll show you where to enable this. But this is basically the same thing as a volunteer can do from home or on their phone. If they log into their account, they can go to print out their activity history. They can do that from here as well. If they click on this View Volunteer Activity History, it brings up a dialog where they can create basically a date range that they want to run this report for. So let's say someone needs to print out their hours for the previous calendar year. They could go and select that date range, click on Filter. They can select everything, or they can choose particular metrics if they want to do that. And then at the bottom, they can click to either print their report. So if you have an attached printer, they could just print that directly, or they can email it. If they email it, it'll get sent to their inbox, and that'll just go directly to them. So whatever email they have on file for their account, it'll just send them that report. Again, this is the same report that volunteers can print on their own. It's the PDF activity history or activity summary. And this is the same thing you can print on volunteer profiles as well. It does include your PDF activity header logo. which generally I would have like letterhead there. Okay, but going back to signing out, when a volunteer clicks to sign out from a shift, a couple things will happen. First of all, it's obviously going to stop recording hours for that person. So it'll cut the timer at however long it's been. That's how much credit they'll get. But also, if you have impact tracking enabled for this particular event and you're allowing volunteers to record that activity on site, then when someone clicks to sign out, it'll pop up a dialog asking for that information. So in my case, I'm asking volunteers, how many miles did you drive during this shift? This is recorded in miles in this case. They can also add notes. And then I'm also asking people for a shift experience rating, and they can just input whatever number they want to through here. And then I can use that to run searches or reports or just go and review that on volunteers. So in this case, when someone clicks log impact and sign out, it'll record again how long they were there and also all those impact tracking metrics. Okay, one final thing about kind of signing in, signing out. I mentioned the idea of walk-in registrations. I just want to show you what that looks like for a new volunteer. So if someone searches for their name and they don't see it, they can click on Add New Volunteer. From there, it'll ask them for their account information. And you can either have this be your full account, so all of your questions from your general application, or Quick Reg. I turned that on for Quick Reg. In this instance, I generally prefer that because I don't want someone to spend as much time, filling out a full application if there's a line of people behind them trying to sign in. So I usually like to use Quick Reg for this particular instance. When someone does create a profile using your Quick Reg account, which again is basically just like a truncated version of your application, then when that person goes to register for something else later, or if they go to log into their account later, they'll be asked for the rest of their account information at that point. But once someone fills this out, clicks on submit, then they also could sign in for a shift using the exact same process that we just walked through. Okay, so that's kind of the standard sign-in console operation. I want to talk about a couple variations of the sign-in console, and then we'll talk about the effects of the sign-in console and kind of where you engage with those changes that we implement through the sign-in console, like how many hours someone is receiving. But one of the variations of the sign-in console we can actually see directly on this page is an option to have a QR code scanner as a part of the sign-in process. Now, the name QR code scanner does not imply that you have to buy some kind of special equipment. Essentially, this just uses whatever camera you have attached to the kiosk that you're using. So if it's a laptop or a tablet, it probably already has 1 or 2 cameras already on the device, so you don't need anything special attached to it. If you're using a desktop, you might need to plug in a webcam. But essentially, there's buttons down here to open either the front or rear facing camera. Again, kind of if you're using like a tablet or a phone. And when you click on that option, it'll pull up whatever your camera is seeing. Now, we're looking at my demonstration console, so we're seeing a QR code GIF here. But generally, when you click on that button, it'll just pull up whatever your camera sees. So it'll show kind of that view. And what this is looking for is for volunteers to hold up a QR code to that camera. The QR code that the volunteer receives can be sent to them in a confirmation message. So you can turn this on for an event, or it could be something that you put onto a badge. So you can print out name tags that would have a QR code on them, and that would allow the volunteer to kind of quickly go through the sign-in console. So there's a couple different ways to use this QR code scanner. Essentially, the volunteer, again, is bringing a code. So they have a QR code that was either sent to them or given to them, and then they hold that up to whatever camera you have on your kiosk, and that will skip the name lookup process or skip the entire check-in process. So if this is open and a volunteer doesn't know what this is looking for, or they're not sure, they can still just look up their name like normal using the name lookup field as well. Okay, but let's talk about this QR code option a little bit more and kind of how to enable that. So QR code sign-in is a mobile sign-in function because it's asking the volunteer to bring a QR code. Now, there is one other way to use name tags with QR codes on them. if we look in the volunteer database, so if we go into search and manage volunteer database, you can create a printout through here. So I could just search for a set of individuals or my whole database, select everyone. And in the drop down here, you can choose to print out QR code name tags or QR code ID badges, which would include their profile photo as well. And these QR codes would basically just skip the name lookup process on the sign-in console. So someone would scan their QR code or scan their ID badge, and then it would essentially just ask them to pick what shift they're signing in for. If they still have to sign your terms, they'd still have to do that. So if they have an outdated copy or an old version, or if you have a questionnaire on your sign-in console, they'd still have to answer those questions, but it would skip the name lookup portion of that. Otherwise, you can also enable QR code sign-in on every event or any event. If we go and look at creating a new opportunity, there's an option in here called allowing mobile volunteer sign-in. There's quite a few options here, but at the bottom we have QR code and QR code express. Now, if you're looking in your system and you don't see these, it's because this is a setting in your system configuration of whether or not to use this in the first place. So we'll look at that more in a moment. But what these two options are, the first one is what we just talked about. So it's a QR code that would skip the name lookup process. And this is a static QR code, so you could put it on a badge. It's the same one that we just saw. You could pull a report to run or to include those QR codes. The other option, QR code express, is unique to this particular opportunity. It actually would send the volunteer in the confirmation message for this opportunity, as well as in the reminder email, a link to open up these QR codes. And there would actually be one for signing in, one for signing out. And those function a little bit more like movie tickets, essentially. Someone would scan that QR code, it would skip the entire check-in process. The system would immediately ding and say they're signed in for their shift, and then the next person could be signing in already. So the express version is the true kind of touchless experience. A volunteer isn't engaging with the kiosk at all manually. They're just holding up a sign-in QR code or a sign-out QR code, depending on which activity they're doing. In either of these two cases, if you have it enabled, again, that link or that QR code gets sent to the volunteer in the confirmation email when they sign up, as well as in the reminder email if you have that enabled. And then if you have reminder text messages turned on, it would also get included in there. Okay, so that's kind of one way to vary the sign-in process. Another way to vary the sign-in process is to use mobile sign-in, which would ask your volunteers to use their own device instead of using a device that you have set up. So let's say you have an upcoming event where you don't have a centralized check-in location, you don't have the ability to get a tablet out there, or you don't have internet access, but you want volunteers to still check in using their own phone. Or maybe volunteers are just operating completely independently, but you still want them to check in. You can turn on mobile sign-in for those options. There's a bunch of different settings here. Most of them are geofenced. And this geofencing, so let's say we turn this on, yes, within half a mile, that will be a radius around the location address. So when a volunteer shows up for their event, they will have gotten a link to sign in the confirmation message, the reminder message, and the reminder text message if you have that set up. And that link would basically just check two things. First of all, is it the day of the event? And second of all, are they within the radius of the location address that you've defined? If those two conditions are met, then that person can just click a button to sign in as if they were using a kiosk that you had set up. So it's kind of the same functionality as the sign-in console, just brought to the volunteer's device instead of using a device that you have set up. So again, this can be geofenced, or you can tell the system to allow volunteers to do this at any location or ignoring locations entirely. These two options are kind of similar. The any location option means it doesn't really care where the volunteer is per se, but the system will still actually record their GPS coordinates when they sign in and when they sign out. So if you're doing something like adopt a park or a trail cleanup or something like that where volunteers are kind of operating independently, but you do care to know where they are when they sign in or when they sign out, either for safety purposes or just to know kind of like what portion of something they were working on, then any location is what you might want to use in that case. The system doesn't necessarily care where they are but it will record where they are when they sign in and when they sign out. It's not actively recording them the entire time they're signed in. It's kind of like a snapshot when they click to sign in and when they click to sign out. Ignore location does kind of exactly what the name sounds like. It doesn't care where they are at all. It's not going to record that information. It's just looking to have the volunteer sign in, and it's tracking those times. So again, all of these options here, apart from the QR code options, the other kind of location-based ones or any or ignore location, these all have the volunteer use their own phone as the sign-in device. So it operates in a similar fashion, but the volunteer is not using a device you have set up. They're using their own phone to do that. If you have one of these options turned on, you can also post a generic QR code that would send volunteers to the same page where they could sign in for that shift. That QR code is something that you can get from our customer support team. So same kind of idea as getting that direct sign-in console link. But let's say you have people, checking in at a tent, and again, it's more remote. You don't have internet access or a tablet set up, but you want people to be able to sign in for their shift. The best thing is for them to use the link that was sent to them. But if volunteers have deleted those emails or they can't find them, you could also have like a backup link posted or a QR code posted that they could scan, and it would send them to essentially the same page where they could sign in for that shift. So they'll only be able to sign in for shifts that are occurring that day and that you have enabled for mobile sign-in. But that can be a nice backup in the case that someone can't find the link that was sent to them in the reminder email, or they're not totally sure what they're supposed to be looking for. Okay, so again, those are kind of different ways to vary the sign-in process. Next, I want to talk about what happens when the sign-in process is used. So essentially where that information gets recorded. So if we look in the opportunity management side of the system, if we go into search and manage existing opportunities, on this page, you can go in obviously to manage any of your events. If you are using the sign-in console for a specific opportunity, so like we used that for an event this morning, and if we go and look at that event here, if I go to view the registered volunteers, you can see on this page, kind of at a glance, who has signed in, who hasn't signed in, and also who has signed out. The way you can see that is with this column, the second column here, this tells us when someone signed in, if they did. So if this icon is present, this kind of stopwatch icon, that tells you that this person did sign in. And if you mouse over it, you can see what time they signed in. If someone didn't sign in, that icon won't be present. If someone signed out as well, you can tell that sort of visually by the color of this calendar icon. This calendar icon on the left, if you mouse over it, tells you when this person was registered and by whom. But if you click on it, you can adjust how much activity that person is receiving, or alternatively, see how much activity they are receiving based on some other adjustment that was made. So like in this case, I signed in at 10:13. If we look on the right-hand side, there's a notes menu that also tells us the time of sign out, which was 10:16. And if we look at this calendar icon, it's gold, which means my hours have been adjusted. Blue is the default for this. And if I click into it, I can see how much activity I'm receiving. So I could also adjust this too if I needed to. So from the admin side, you can always make adjustments here. But again, if you're using the sign-in console, that's going to take place automatically based on the times that someone signs in and out. So looking at this list here, we can tell right away, this person didn't sign in, this person didn't sign in, this person didn't sign in, neither did this person. And so if I needed to, I could go and mark all of those individuals as no-shows. That'll do two things. It removes them from the event so they don't get credit. It also adds a no-show note to their profile, which is something you can search by. You can find volunteers based on how many no-shows they've had within a given time frame. So again, you can kind of readily see who didn't sign in. And on the same kind of token, you can also see people who signed in and out because their calendar icon has changed to gold. So you know their hours are being adjusted. And you can always go and manually do that as well. Like if you know this person was present, you could go and give them credit for how long they were there. Or if you just want to see that they were signed in, you can also, from this same page, mark someone as being signed in. So this is one place where you can kind of engage that information. If you are doing impact tracking as well, you'll see that on the right-hand side here. So there's an icon for impact tracking. Again, black is the default, gold would be if it's been recorded. And you can click into that to see or adjust those numbers. And one other thing you can do if you are using the sign-in console is you can quickly mark no-shows by running a kind of bulk action. If we step back to the opportunity dashboard, I could select all of my open opportunities, or I could search for something that is closed that's already happened. But in the bulk actions here at the top, in this drop-down menu, I can go in and say mark no-shows. What this will do is it doesn't automatically mark no-shows, but it pulls a list of any person that did not sign in for a shift that has already taken place. So you can kind of quickly see, okay, here's all the people that didn't sign in for shifts that already happened. I could go through and say, hey, actually, I remember that Jack was there. I'm going to mark him as signed in. And then everybody else, these are all no-shows. And I can just say mark as no-show, and that'll kind of take that action in bulk for all these people. Again, removes them from the event so they don't get credit. It also adds a no-show note to their profile, which again is something you can search by. So just to kind of reiterate that menu item to mark no-shows will pull the list of every person who didn't sign in for any shift that has already occurred. So we won't see things that are still ongoing or upcoming. We only see stuff that has already taken place and the people who didn't sign in for those things. Okay, there's two more things that I want to show today with the sign-in console. One of those is that when you have the sign-in console open in admin mode, you can see, who all is currently signed in. You can sign people out. You can see the total number. So if you're trying to get an idea of like how many people are in the building, this is a quick way to do that. And again, that sign-in console can also be filtered. So maybe you don't want to see everyone who's signed in. Maybe you only want to see people who are signed in under a particular tag or within a particular category. So you can go and apply that as a filter. So you're not necessarily looking at all of the accounts, just a subset. And that might change the number that you're looking at there. Okay, and then the last thing that I want to point out today is where are all of these settings that I kept alluding to? So in your system configuration, if you go into Edit System Configuration under System Management, there's a section called Sign-in Console or Kiosk Options. And this section contains all of the different settings associated with the sign-in console. So the first one you'll see here is the option to allow walk-in registration via the sign-in console. There's two yes options here. Yes, and then yes with reservation codes. With reservation codes just means that volunteers could use a reservation code as a walk-in. It doesn't mean that they have to. So if you're working with groups and you're having them sign in for shifts as they arrive, and you've reserved spots for them, you might have some people who neglect to register ahead of time. So having this setting turned on this way can be pretty useful. Below that, there's a setting that enables automatic sign out. If you're using the sign-in console specifically with service projects, you can set an automatic sign out time period where if somebody forgets to sign out when they leave, instead of just kind of persisting, it would sign them out at the end of the day and give them X number of credit hours. This setting also applies to any event where you've set the default credit hours to 0. Okay, and then I mentioned printing name tags on site. This is where that setting is enabled. So you can turn that on through here. Just turn this to yes, and then you can define different locations if you have multiple printers. And then the questionnaire that we saw, if you want to edit that or add that in, that's done through here. You can have up to 3 questions. Again, these can be restrictive. You can have a required response, or they can just be information collection. And then whether or not your terms are displayed on the sign-in console is also a setting in here. You can turn this on or off. It's up to you. I typically like to have that on, just kind of ensuring that if somebody signs in for a shift, I have their terms kind of signed already. Below that, the sign-in console verification, so that phone number verification option. And then next are a couple new settings you might not have seen previously. You can show the list of signed in volunteers in the sign-in console. This is kind of always true on the admin side. If you want to, you can have that list show up on the volunteer side. If you want that information to kind of be publicly visible when people are signing in, like who's already signed in, you can turn that on through here. And then the option to allow volunteers to print out their activity or print out their report through the sign-in console. We looked at that today. That is also a setting that's off by default, so you can go in and turn that on. And then QR code sign-in is also a setting in here. So again, if you don't see those QR code options that I was talking about, that's because this setting needs to be enabled in your system. Just go in here and set that to yes. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to cover for today. A couple questions that came up throughout. One is, can you use different versions of the sign-in console together? So that's a great question. And the answer is yes. You can have any number of sign-in consoles open at the same time. You can have mobile sign-in in use at the same time as the standalone console. You can be checking people in on the admin side if you want to. They all kind of communicate directly with your console. So like somebody could sign in using a kiosk you have set up and then sign out using their phone, or vice versa. That would work just fine. And again, just to reiterate, you can have any number of kiosks set up at once as well. So a volunteer could sign in on one, tablet and sign out on another laptop, and that's totally fine as well. Okay, as always, if you have any questions about what we've covered today, feel free to reach out to our customer support team. I want to reiterate that we have all of our previously recorded webinars posted on YouTube. We'll send that link in the chat again if you'd like to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can just follow that link to kind of follow us along there. You can always just go and check that also. But thank you so much for your time today. It's a pleasure to see you all. I know I've met with a lot of you directly, so just thank you again for joining. We're looking forward to the year ahead and all the wonderful work that we get to partner with you all in doing. So as always, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to our customer support team. Or access that YouTube channel and all the articles that are accessible there. So thanks for your time. Have a good rest of your week.